Hey up viewers and vieweresses, my name is General Strategist and I'm bringing you something a lot different to my usual content today. You're watching a special video I produced, General Red Reflects at Wolfenstein. Now this is probably going to be quite a long video, so bear with me on it. Grab a bowl of popcorn, maybe a pint of cider or a cup of tea, put your feet up and hope you enjoy. Now, as a lot of you no doubt know, last month saw the release of the latest instalment in the Wolfenstein franchise, The Old Blood, which is basically a prequel to 2014's The New Order. I bought The Old Blood not long after its release, and have since played through the entire thing, and after I did so, I kind of began to reflect back even on the Wolfenstein franchise, and most specifically on Return to Castle Wolfenstein. That's mainly because, as anybody who's played The Old Blood will know, there are a lot of things in it which are either references or nods back to things that happened in RTCW. So, after I had this reflective moment on the Wolfenstein franchise, I decided to produce this video, because why the hell not? Now, it shouldn't really be a secret to many of you that of all the Wolfenstein games I've ever played, like Wolfenstein 2009, The New Order, The Old Blood, etc., etc., RTCW is my favourite by far. None of the other Wolfenstein games have even come close, I'd say, to matching the kind of impression that RTCW left me with when I first played it. So that's what this video is mainly going to be about. It's going to be about RTCW, it's going to be about why RTCW is my favourite of all the Wolfenstein games, what I feel makes it stand out from all of the other titles, and why I feel that it's fully... Why I feel that it's fully deserving of the positive reviews that it generally gets. Everything you're about to hear in this video is, of course, my own opinion. This isn't meant to be like a formal critique or review of the Wolfenstein franchise. If anything, it's more like just a detailed summary of my own feelings towards RTCW, interspersed with plenty of references to other Wolfenstein titles, of course. Feel free to disagree with me in the comments on any of the points I argue. But before I actually go any further, before I launch into this, I should make clear right now that this video will probably contain spoilers, not only about RTCW, but also about any other game in the Wolfenstein series, such as Wolfenstein 2009, The New Order and The Old Blood. I know that my good friend Phil wants to get The New Order at some point, and possibly also The Old Blood, and thus doesn't want me to spoil anything about those games. Now, doubtlessly, there will also be many of you viewers out there who similarly will want to avoid spoilers as well, because you might be still trying to get your hands on, say, The Old Blood or The New Order. So, as I said, before I launch into this discussion video, I'm just putting forward this warning right now. If you do not want any of the Wolfenstein games spoiled for you, especially the newer ones, do not watch this video. Seriously, stop watching right now. But with that out of the way, let's get down to business and talk about RTCW. Now, RTCW is an old game. It came out in 2001, which makes it well over 10 years old by now. Yet, it's a game which many people still play, because there's this whole community of people still out there who make and play mods and maps and add-ons for the game, despite the fact that it's over a decade in age, and that there have been successive Wolfenstein titles since 2001. This, of course, is one reason why I think the game has endured over time, and why it's my favourite of all Wolfenstein games. The modding tools for RTCW are freely available, thus users are kind of encouraged to, and able to, actually build upon the game by producing their own custom content. And when you've got a good number of people out there who are producing these sort of things, like these new maps and new add-ons, who are basically producing these kind of things every so often, it maintains interest in the game, it keeps it alive, basically. That's actually one of the reasons why games like Minecraft, incidentally, have also proved so popular back in recent years, simply because they were easy to modify and customise, and that really encouraged the development of a whole community around the game. It's also the reason actually why Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, I think, is still going strong, even though it is also now just over 10 years old. But that's just one reason why RTCW is my favourite Wolfenstein title. Whilst it's definitely worth mentioning, I'm not going to focus too much on the whole custom content side of things. I'm mainly actually going to focus on the vanilla game itself, more specifically on the single player aspect, since that's the part of the game that I've spent the most time playing in all the years I've owned it. Now, Probably the one thing that many people will remember from single-player RTCW, which sets it apart from the likes of Wolfenstein 2009, The New Order, or The Old Blood, was undoubtedly the horror aspect. Now, I remember when I first played RTCW as a teenager, years and years ago, it was probably the first game I ever played that had a horror element to it, and it certainly provided plenty of scares. I can remember the catacomb levels in Mission 2. I mean, geez, Christ, they scared the crap out of me. I won't deny it. I can remember at one point, as I got deeper into those levels, I actually stopped playing for a good few days. Yeah, mainly just because I was too much of a pussy to keep going. But eventually I did man up and I was able to get through it. Now, I certainly remember the horror aspect of RTCW most of all. You know, it was probably that big one element of the game that made the most impression on me. Or rather, it was the element of the game that made the biggest impression on me, even. But there's more to it than just the horror. To really understand why RTCW is my favourite Wolfenstein game, you have to dig a bit deeper. You have to ask, what's underneath it all? What's underpinning the horror? What's underpinning the action? What's basically underneath everything that makes it all effective? So, if I was asked to choose one word to sum up what this is, it wouldn't be a word like awesome or epic. It wouldn't be horror either, even though the horror aspect was, as I've said, one of the most memorable parts of the game. Now again, as I said a moment ago, there's more to it. It would in fact be a much different word that I would pick, which I feel captures the spirit of the game much better. Now, I've actually, I think, said this before in a reply to a comment that was once left on one of my RTCW custom map videos. I can't remember which video it was, but I'm absolutely certain that I have said this. But the beauty of RTCW lies in its subtlety. That's the word I would use to sum up why RTCW is my favourite of all the Wolfenstein games. Subtlety. Right? When you hear that word, subtlety, you probably think of phrases like less is more and bigger isn't always better. And that's exactly what I'm getting at here. RTCW, in my opinion, doesn't try to be big or massive or epic. You know, it doesn't try to wow you with vast, over-the-top maps. It doesn't try to blast your eardrums out with booming soundtracks. Everything is much more subtle, and it works. Obviously, now, I should make clear, the Wolfenstein franchise is renowned for the fact that it often incorporates the fantastical, you know, whether it involves, say, stopping a Nazi plot to raise an undead army from hell, or blasting away legions of mutant SS soldiers in power armour with futuristic weapons in an alternate timeline. And RTCW, of course, is no exception to that, with its kind of dark and foreboding plot of Nazi occult rituals and disturbingly twisted science. But the key difference between RTCW and other games in the Wolfenstein series is the way in which the fantastical is handled. Because, in my opinion, RTCW handled the fantastical in a way which didn't become over the top. Let's start, like, for example, with the graphics and the environments you find yourself in. When I first played RTCW many years ago, to me, the maps and the level design felt kind of realistic. They felt like actual locations that could exist in a real-world setting. There were no oversized Nazi super fortresses with walls as high as the skies, or giant zeppelins armed with doomsday weapons, or mystical dimensions overflowing with supernatural energy, like what you see in the later Wolfenstein games. And something else as well. If you compare the graphical design of the levels and environments between the Wolfenstein games, for me, RTCW's level design was more subtle. It was often, like, grungier, dirtier, greyer, darker, in short, much more realistic. Whereas in contrast, there were times in, like, Wolfenstein 2009 or The New Order where, to me, the environments felt like either very colourful or, in some cases, shiny and squeaky clean. Now, I'm just going to make clear, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. Indeed, I enjoyed quite a few of the levels in those later games, but still, I preferred RTCW's greyer, grungier maps even more. And that's something else as well. Not only did the level design of RTCW convey a sense of realism, so too did what I like to call the temporal setting of the plot. And what I mean by that is that when the game takes place, which is in 1943, the midway point of the Second World War. What I liked about that setting was that the events of RTCW felt, to me at least, like something that could genuinely have happened in a real-world timeline without any of us knowing. I hope that garbled sentence I just came out with makes sense, but the thing is, the events of RTCW don't intrude on the real-world timeline, at least not as far as I'm aware they don't. You know, they don't require real-life events to be rewritten in order to fit around the storyline. To me, RTCW essentially felt as though it was meant to be taking place in the real world, whereas later games in the Wolfenstein franchise, particularly the New Order and the Old Blood, were different in that they necessitated the rewriting of aspects of history in order to actually suit their storylines. Again, this isn't a criticism of those games. My point is that, in contrast to RTCW, whilst playing the New Order and the Old Blood, I was kind of consciously aware that the storyline unfolding before me was clearly an alternate history, set in a parallel universe where events turned out differently to how they did in the real world. Whereas with RTCW, on the other hand, it was much more kind of subtle in that it situated itself, or at least it felt that way to me, in an actual real-world timeline. Okay, now, moving on from that, the subtlety does actually continue in other aspects of the game. So, let's take the sound design, for example. I mean, in terms of soundtracks, most of RTCW's music, it isn't like loud or booming or overwhelming. Most of it is a lot more subtle. It's designed to provide ambience, and in many cases actually quite sort of tense or unnerving ambience, and it works because of that subtlety. It plays quietly in your ears, gradually fraying your nerves and tensing you up. It makes you worried of what might be waiting around the next corner. In contrast to that, you had like Wolfenstein 2009, which often opted for the complete opposite, for music tracks that were louder, more orchestral, which would boom in your ears. The New Order also had its fair share of loud music, which was designed not so much to create fear as just to get your adrenaline flowing and put you in a kind of, how should we say, like a mass Nazi slaying mood. And basically, again, I'll repeat, that's not a criticism of those games. Indeed, louder tracks can work in terms of helping to establish that adrenaline pumping sprint and shoot feel that games like Wolfenstein 2009 and the New Order were going for. But the reason I rank RTCW's style over those is because I just tend to fall down on the less is more side of the fence. Apologies also, by the way, for the fact that I've had to start clearing my throat like that. Obviously I've been talking for at least 10 minutes now, so yeah, my voice is going to start going, so I don't know how much longer this will go on for, but let's just keep going. Apart from the soundtrack, obviously, there's also sound effects. You have to talk about the things that you just hear in the background that don't fall under the music category. In general, both RTCW and its successors certainly did well in this regard, but in reference to RTCW, what I did like were the really small touches that created that sense of immersion in the setting, and in particular here I'm talking about those moments where you'd like wander into a room and you would overhear like the Horst Wessel lead playing on a radio, or Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata or Furelise, or even Adolf Hitler just ranting and raving about something or other. I mean, like I said, they're only little details, but in my opinion, it's often the little details that can really make something good. And I'll be honest, those little radio sounds of like Horst Wessel or Furelise or Old Adolf are something that I don't think were actually really incorporated into Wolfenstein 2009 or the New Order or the Old Blood. They didn't really feature anything like that as far as I'm aware. I mean, they did feature like various areas where there were like radio sounds, where like radio sets on tables in different rooms and you could hear like static or something, but nothing like that you heard in RTCW. I mean, the beauty essentially of RTCW's little details was that they all contributed to immersing you in the setting, more or less. So basically subtlety aids with immersion, and it's not just tiny subtle sound details that can have a really good impression though. The point I'm going to make here actually is that apart from sound, interactivity with the environment is also important for immersion. And RTCW had lots of additional little things that weren't, as far as I'm aware, in any of its successors. again, I'll repeat, we're talking about interactivity with the environment now. So we're talking about things like the fact that you could knock into or attack certain pieces of furniture, which would cause them to respond either by moving along the floor or by being destroyed. Or we could talk about banners and pictures on walls that you could break, like alarm boxes that you could trigger or turn off at will, or even in RTCW, like the chairs that you could pick up off the floor and you could use them as a one-handed weapon. You could move them around and even wield them and strike enemies with them. Or like the suits of armour that you could knock over to try and hurt enemies, or like oil barrels you could ignite and blow up. I mean, Wolfenstein 2009, by comparison, did maintain a degree of subtle interactivity with objects in the environment. I mean, it had like destructible boxes, various things that you could pick up, like the axes or the sledgehammers. There were like the explosive barrels you could shoot. There were the Veil energy barrels as well, come to think of it, which you could pick up and throw and get energy from. But to me, you then got into the New Order and the Old Blood, which besides like particularly wooden crates that you can smash open to find goodies, they didn't seem to have that same degree of environmental interactivity, in my opinion. I mean, the Old Blood, a little bit more than the New Order. The Old Blood had a little bit more interactive objects, but you know, it had like objects that you could shoot to make them burst or explode under stress, like fire extinguishers, the jerry cans, the pressurized gas canisters. But still, there were so many environmental objects which weren't interactive, but which, in my opinion, should have been. Like, no matter how much I pummeled it with a knife, or in the case of the Old Blood, the rusty pipe, you know, there were so many random things which should have broken under the stress. I mean, some of you might argue that I'm nitpicking a bit now, but I would counter that, and I would say, as insignificant as some details might seem, in terms of immersion, you know, they can still be incredibly important. I know that developers obviously don't have the time in the development process to go through each and every environment and make every last inanimate object capable of responding to various stimuli, but even so, come on, I mean, if a heavy chair can shift at the slightest touch from a moving entity, then why not also say a fragile little teacup or a wine bottle? So that's what I'd say about interactivity with the environments and how little details there, little subtle details, can all contribute to the immersion. Subtlety, again, continues to be seen in RTCW with the weapons, the game mechanics. Again, fitting in with what I was saying before about how RTCW felt like something that could be taking place in a real-world timeline. The weapons you picked up throughout the game were generally kept very realistic, with only a couple of exceptions. And even then, most of those exceptions were pretty minor, in my opinion. You know, in RTCW, there are no over-the-top, like, assault rifle, rocket launcher combos, or sniper rifle that also doubles as a laser submachine gun type weapons that you saw in the New Order. Now, don't get me wrong here, such weapons were fun to use in the New Order, but RTCW used historical weapons from the actual World War II time period. So it used MP40s, Sten guns, Mauser rifles, etc. You know, FG42s, they were quite fun to use as well. And on top of that, there was a sheer variety of weapons. You had, I mean, come on, let's go through what we actually had. We had a knife, we had 2 types of pistol, 3 types of SMG, 3 types of rifle, 2 types of grenade, dynamite, Panzerfaust, flamethrower, minigun, Tesla weapon. You know, there were only 3 weapons in RTCW that were entirely fictional, and those were the OSA snooper rifle, the Venom gun, and the Tesla gun. The first of those, the snooper, is, if you think about it, still quite a realistic weapon, even if it is fictional. You know, suppressors that could muffle the sound of a gunshot, well, they were easily available in World War II. And plus, you know, that was also, World War II was also the time period when you saw night vision technology coming into development. In reference to the Venom gun, for example, you know, that's a little more fantastical, but, you know, the basic premise of it is not entirely far-fetched. You know, Gatling guns were made back in the 1860s, and I'm pretty sure that old what's-his-name, the guy who created them, was he called Dr. John Gatling or Richard Gatling? It was one or the other. You know, at one point he did, I think, look at producing a Gatling gun that was powered by an electric motor. And no, you know, even though handheld versions of miniguns aren't possible even today, you know, the basic technology required to produce an electrically powered one was easily available during World War II. So the Venom gun's not an entirely far-fetched weapon. The only actual weapon in RTCW that really exists purely in the realm of science fiction would be the Tesla gun, you know. So, you know, moving on from RTCW, successive games afterwards, you know, they started to push the boundaries a bit, the boundaries of realism, that is. In Wolfenstein 2009, for example, you had 3 incredibly fantastical weapons. You had Particle Cannon, Tesla Gun, and the Leichenfaust 44. And once again, don't get me wrong, they were a hell of a lot of fun to play with, but they don't exactly fit with the idea of subtlety, because they're so over-the-top, out there, you know. But, you know, I must admit, having said that Wolfenstein 2009's Tesla Gun was pretty fucking awesome, you know. That sweet electrical crackle it makes as you chain electrocute multiple Nazis. Damn, that was a satisfying noise. Beyond Wolfenstein 2009, though, you know, the New Order took some of its weapons to bigger, even more over-the-top heights. You know, I've already mentioned 2. There was that assault rifle rocket launcher combo and that sniper rifle that turns into a laser submachine gun. You know, add to that a clunky laser gun that can vaporise human targets like in almost practically one shot. And as well as also that shotgun that can fire bouncing cluster shots. You know, you get the picture. They're good fun to play with, but damn, they're incredibly wacky, let's put it that way. Though interestingly, the Old Blood did actually go back, I thought, kind of in the opposite direction somewhat. I like some of the weapons in the Old Blood, particularly the Bomb and Schuss, or Bomb and Schuss, I'm not entirely sure how you pronounce it. I'll call it Bomb and Schuss, that makes sense to me. That weapon actually reminded me a lot of the Carabiner 98K from Wolfenstein 2009, or the Mauser in RTCW. It was basically some good old-fashioned sniper rifle gunplay. I mean, maybe it was because although the Old Blood's weapons were fictional, what with it being set in an alternate 1946, you know, they still felt kind of realistic, some of them. I mean, the one slight exception to that was the pistol rocket launcher thing. But connected to the use of weapons, we have game mechanics, especially how you deal with enemies. Now, RTCW shone for me because it often emphasised a more subtle approach to dealing with your foes. Because quite often in that game, just charging in directly with all your guns blazing would get you killed. Instead, you'd often end up utilising a much stealthier, more tactical approach. You know, usually you'd end up using the knife, a suppressed Luger, the Sten, or the Snooper to carry out silent takedowns. I mean, there were still moments in RTCW where gun battles would take place, but even then, you often still found yourself having to be a bit more tactical. You'd have to, like, pop up quickly, take a few shots, then move between cover as fast as you could, or find ways to flank the enemies to take them by surprise, etc, etc. All in all, RTCW's mechanics were fairly sound in my opinion. They struck a good kind of balance between action and stealth. Now, then we had Wolfenstein 2009, where, I'll be honest, to me, the stealth system at times felt almost negligible. You know, I'll be honest here, this is a criticism at this point I do have of that game. Yes, there were some stealth mechanics there. You know, there was a melee attack which you could use to take out enemies from behind, and plus there were silencer upgrades for the MP40 and the Carabiner 98K, but you know, there wasn't like a knife or any sort of like dedicated stealth melee weapon or anything like that. And the thing about Wolfenstein 2009 is there was no kind of compulsion to use stealth at any point in the game, I felt. You know, I don't know about everyone else who's played Wolfenstein 2009, but in all the times I've played it, both during my Let's Play that I did on this channel and plus in my spare time, I don't think I've ever bothered with the stealth mechanics. I mean, there were certainly no missions, as I said, that demanded their use, like there were in RTCW. I mean, in contrast, the New Order and the Old Blood, they did try to bring back the stealth mechanics seen in RTCW, whilst at the same time bringing in their more kind of OTT gunplay style. You know, when I say OTT gunplay style, I basically mean like sprinting and sliding whilst shooting and dual wielding, things like that. I mean, you know, generally the New Order and the Old Blood, they did a good job, you know, of both bringing back the stealth and in creating their own unique gunplay style. I mean, certainly in the New Order and the Old Blood's case, they did actually have levels where stealth was the only way forward. They brought back the knife, for example, and in the Old Blood's case, you had the rusty pipe. You know, both of those which you could use to carry out some silent, but I must say particularly brutal takedowns. My only complaints about the stealth mechanics of the New Order and the Old Blood were as follows. Firstly, I would have liked to see a greater variety of stealth weapons. I mean, in RTCW, you had, what, like 4 weapons, which were all good for stealth. You had knife, you had the Luger, which you could fit the silencer to, you had the Sten, and then you had the Snooper. In the New Order, you just had the knife, and then in the Moon-based mission, you had the silenced pistol. In the Old Blood, there were just 3. There were just the knife, the rusty pipe, and the silenced pistol. So yeah, perhaps a greater variety of stealth weapons would have been more interesting. Maybe like a sniper rifle, or maybe actually, come to think of it, like you could have had a like upgrade maybe for the say the bomb and shuss, which could have added like a suppressor to it. I don't know, something like that maybe. But secondly, my other complaint about the stealth mechanics in those 2 games was less actually to do with the mechanics, more to do with the enemy AI, come to think of it. There are occasions during the stealthier parts of those 2 games where the enemy AI even could be a little rusty. Like, you find situations where one enemy would pass within mere meters of the body of one of his comrades, and yet somehow completely fail to notice it. So, yeah, it broke the immersion a bit, I'll be honest. But since I'm now mentioning the enemies, we'll move on to them. Again, the difference to note between RTCW's enemies and those of successive Wolfenstein games tends to be one of subtlety, once more. The enemies in RTCW, as fantastical as some of them were, still, in my opinion, had a degree of subtlety about them. I mean, what struck me in particular about the non-human enemies of RTCW, namely the zombies, the lopers, the super soldiers, was often how kind of creepily quiet they actually were. You know, no sort of loud, inhuman screeching or jabbering or roaring, just sort of very horrible, grotesque rasping or low clunking of metal as they move and attack. It's subtle, but it's unsettling. As for the human enemies, the actual Nazis in RTCW, they were fairly realistic. They're just a bunch of armed soldiers. I mean, even the elite guards didn't actually, in my opinion, push the boundaries that much, and that's really saying something, considering that for most of World War II, the thought of a woman serving in a military role in Hitler's German war machine would have been viewed as preposterous, even, you know, given the, well, not even, but what with given the Nazi ideal woman being the keeper of the home. Successive games after that started to introduce more foes that were kind of OTT, both human and non-human. I mean, taking Wolfenstein 2009, I seem to recall like partly zombified elite guards, like magic-throwing Nazi scholars, invisible ninja Nazis, and like giant monsters from the Black Sun dimension. I mean, come the New Order and the Old Blood, and you have BJ Blazkowicz like fighting against legions of power-armoured super soldiers, airborne drones, and large laser-firing battle robots, which is fun, don't get me wrong, it's fun to play, and God, you know, I definitely recommend it, but it's not subtle. That's the point I'm trying to make, you know. It's not a criticism of Wolfenstein 2009, the New Order, or the Old Blood. I'm not saying any of it's bad, but on the contrary, what I am saying is, well, actually, no, not on the contrary, but what I'm saying is it's just an observation of the difference between RTCW and its successors. You get what I'm trying to put across here, I hope. Okay, now, we've almost covered everything in this huge video discussion, but there's still a couple more things I want to talk about. Namely, I want to talk about storyline progression, and I want to talk about characters. We'll start with the first of those 2. We're not going to talk so much about subtlety anymore here, as this doesn't relate so much to what I'm about to say next, but all the Wolfenstein games essentially have interesting storylines, you can't deny that. RTCW has its dark story of Nazi occultism and the resurrection of the dead, with its very explicit horror overtones. Wolfenstein 2009 has its tale of the Nazis meddling with supernatural energy siphoned from another dimension. Then there's the New Order, with its alternate history of a world where Nazism prevailed in World War II, and then you have the Old Blood, which is very much kind of a bit of a homage to RTCW, with its storyline of Nazi paranormal meddling resulting in horrible forces being unleashed. But not only is it important for a game to have an intriguing storyline, it's also important for that storyline to progress in a smooth and flowing manner, and RTCW did this very well. This is what I mean when I say storyline progression. Every mission you undertook in RTCW ultimately served a clear purpose. You know, they deliver exposition, they reveal key details to the overarching plot, and by the end of the game, you are able to piece all of those fragments of information together, and the culmination of all of that becomes clear. You can see how basically how everything has built up to the final moment. Let's actually go through RTCW's missions, and I'll tell you what I mean here. Let's start with mission 1, which sets the foundations. You have Blazkowicz escaping from Castle Wolfenstein and then setting out to investigate supposed paranormal activities in the town of Wolfsburg. Mission 2 then brings in the occult. Mission 3 brings Operation Resurrection to the fore, to the attention of the OSA staff. Mission 4 then brings in references to Operation Uber Soldat and DETE's X-Labs, and Mission 5 then connects everything up when you find that Operation Resurrection project book. It basically shows how all of this will serve Operation Resurrection's ultimate purpose, which was to resurrect Heinrich I. And missions 6 and 7 are thus the culmination of all of that, where Blazkowicz sets out to put a permanent stop to this Nazi plot. In short, in RTCW it felt like there was direction and purpose to every mission I was undertaking. In contrast to that, Wolfenstein 2009 sometimes felt like it was struggling with that a bit. At least that's how it felt to me. I don't think I actually ever said this during my Let's Play of Wolfenstein 2009, but on reflection, there were times when I wondered what purpose each mission was ultimately serving, besides just preventing the Nazis from utilising the energy of the Black Sun for some unspecified, though undoubtedly nefarious end. I mean, come on, let's look at the actual missions, starting with the final ones here. Wolfenstein 2009 culminates with Blazkowicz having to fight his way into a Nazi airfield to board a supply blimp that takes him to DETE's Zeppelin, where he will ultimately prevent DETE from using a doomsday weapon to destroy Eisenstadt. But this doomsday weapon is only explicitly mentioned, at least to the best of my recollection, in the briefing prior to the airfield mission. I don't recall ever hearing anything about it prior to that moment, and to me, a lot of the missions before that didn't feel like they were working towards that particular end goal. I mean, maybe I was missing something, I don't know, but it would have been better if Wolfenstein 2009, I think, had established more of a rationale for each mission beyond the simple justification of, oh, the Nazis are meddling with bad forces, go stop them. You know, it would have been better if the developers had somehow made each mission ultimately tie in to the final stages of the game in a more explicit kind of way. Fortunately, this was something that the New Order and the Old Blood managed to do. With those games, each mission did serve a clear purpose when it came to progressing the story, so they definitely kind of learned from RTCW and the experiences of Wolfenstein 2009, in my opinion. Now, the final area of this video discussion is going to focus a bit on characters, and the likes of characterization, character development, that sort of thing. This is where other people might actually have more mixed views of RTCW, because, let's be honest, RTCW didn't really have any character development. Blazkowicz in that game is very much a silent protagonist with no dialogue at any point, at least not in the PC version. I mean, I don't know about versions of RTCW on other consoles, but certainly in the PC version, you know, as far as I remember, he had absolutely no lines of dialogue. As for other characters, well, the OSA staff, for example, they only feature in cutscenes between missions. Their dialogue is pretty much limited to their work and doesn't really reveal any, like, personal matters. Friendly characters, such as Kreisau Circle operatives, they are fairly rare and appear too briefly for there to be any sort of meaningful character development. Even the Nazi villains themselves in RTCW often only appear in person for short amounts of time. I mean, for example, the most we see of Helga von Bülow in person is in one short cutscene where she's berating Professor Zenf, then in another where she kills the guy only to get herself killed off camera by the Alaric. The most we see of the rather, how should we say, underdressed Madame Blavatsky is in a short cutscene at the very end of the game when the newly resurrected Heinrich I practically zombifies her. DETE himself in RTCW appears in person a little more, but beyond the knowledge that he's a brilliant and ruthless scientist who holds only his Uber Soldat project closest to his heart, there's little else in the way of characterization. Now, some people will have differing views on this matter. Some might see this lack of character development as a negative thing, whereas other people might not. My own view of it is a bit more complex. In reference to Blazkowicz's silent nature and lack of character development, I'm pretty neutral on that. I don't see it as a good or a bad thing. I mean, in reference to the lack of development of other characters, though, I actually kind of prefer it. One thing I always felt whilst playing RTCW was a sense of isolation. Like, I was the sole person who was out there trying to stop the Nazi plot. The burden was very much on my shoulders, and the lack of any significant allied characters who assist you for more than one level contributed to that feeling. It was, in short, a subtle sense of isolation that served a purpose, and in a way the avoidance of character development aided that. I didn't get that same sense of isolation in any games after RTCW. I mean, you take Wolfenstein 2009, you have not one, not two, but three groups of people who are all constantly, who you can constantly rely on for assistance even. So you have the Kreisau Circle, the Golden Dawn, and the Black Market. Whilst in the New Order and the Old Blood, you have plenty of friendly characters, though I must say that in the Old Blood, a fair few of them do end up dead. I mean, one thing I actually really liked about the New Order and the Old Blood in particular was the character development. I mean, Blazkowicz is the main example there, of course. You know, we learn much more about him than we ever did in RTCW or even in, like, Wolfenstein 3D. But in reference to the most recent two Wolfenstein games, I was especially pleased by the villains, because they got quite a bit of attention. The villains of the New Order and the Old Blood felt like they weren't just your pretty standard two-dimensional bad guys. They had, like, character, they had motivations, different personalities, they had idiosyncrasies, which were revealed through a combination of means. Firstly, through a combination of sort of overt face-to-face encounters and conversations, and then also through more subtle, indirect hints, such as like collectible texts that you could find, like letters, etc. I mean, Death's Head in the New Order. I mean, God, he's just such a much more murderous psychopath than ever before, but at the same time, his cruelty is complemented by a kind of disturbing charisma. I mean, I remember that final sequence of the New Order where you're fighting through his compound and you listen to him taunting you over the loudspeaker system. That really gave me, in my opinion, some insight into the character's head. Then you have other villains, like the delightfully sadistic combination of Frau Engel and her young lover Booby. I mean, you know, they were just such a pair. I mean, I remember that first time you encounter them on the night train to Berlin, and I've never suffered a more tense moment in a game. Then come the Old Blood and you have new villains with their own distinctive personalities. You have Rudi Jaeger, who is morbidly fascinating, hinted at in various texts to be a complete psycho, and he like loves his dog Greta to the point of just like he goes berserk when Blazkowicz kills her, and yet he has no qualms about brutally, sadistically torturing human beings. And then you have Helga von Schabs, who's clearly a sort of homage back to Helga von Bülow and Dr. Schabs from the original Wolfenstein 3D. And she's fascinating because she's this sort of Nazi occultist who is also a bit of a wine connoisseur. And then in that fantastic scene in the Old Blood, where you're in the inn in Wolfsburg, where you're posing as a waiter and you bring her the wine, and then she suddenly has you sit down opposite her at her table and then begins to share some interesting details about her own background. That is just so tense but so brilliantly done, in my opinion. And all these kind of details are offered in very subtle ways, or often revealed in very subtle ways. It's just so fantastic how it's done. Part of me actually wonders whether RTCW could have actually incorporated some development of its villains in a similar way. I mean, it would have been interesting perhaps to see a bit more of maybe Helga von Bülow or Death's Head, perhaps. But overall, for me, the characterization side of things, that's only a minor issue. As I've said, my view of it is pretty neutral. In summary, RTCW is my favourite of all Wolfenstein titles because of its subtlety. I've been referring back to this quite a lot throughout this discussion because, as I said earlier, for me, it's the main reason why RTCW worked so well. Whether it's a low, disturbing ambient sound effect or music track in the background, or a dark, confined tunnel with disturbing scratch marks on the floor, or a grotesque entity that acts in a bizarre and unsettling way, or a storyline where everything is linked together in sometimes small but significant ways, it is the subtle details that make the game so good. And this pretty much concludes this discussion. I hope you've enjoyed watching this mammoth video. This is undoubtedly the longest thing I think I've ever put out on my channel. Feel free to let me know your own thoughts on RTCW and other Wolfenstein games in the comments. Again, as I've been reiterating throughout, most of the comments I've made about other Wolfenstein titles, such as 2009 or The New Order or The Old Blood, aren't necessarily criticisms, they're just observations, with one or two exceptions. All Wolfenstein games are, overall, good in their own right for different reasons, but RTCW will always remain my favourite for the foreseeable future, unless a new Wolfenstein is produced which harks right back to the similar kind of subtle style of RTCW, of course. But other than that, there's little else for me to say other than thank you for watching, and I hope you all join me for the next video, whatever that might be, and in the meantime, this is General Red, signing off. Goodbye.